Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Realistic with Realistic Productions, and I'm here in the studio doing another tutorial for SoundOracle.net. And one of the questions that I get asked the most, and I keep hearing it come up in the Unquantized podcast, is what's better, analog or digital? And the truth is there's really no right answer. That they both have their upsides and they both have their downsides. So what I wanted to do was get in the studio and go over the different pros and the different cons for each one. And then at the end of the video, you can make the decision. So I'm going to start out with the things that I really think are positive for analog. And just right off the bat, the first thing that has attracted me about the analog world forever is that I can physically touch the knobs. I can actually come over here and dial in things and be able to really critique things the way that I want to on the board. And I can't do that with the software. I feel like I'm lacking that as far as I'm just dragging a mouse over a parameter on there and I gotta like move it around versus me being able to get in there and touch it. Now, another thing that I really think is a positive about analog is it makes you have to rely on your ears more, right? So like what I mean by that is there's not a spectral analysis on this board. Whereas when you're using software and stuff, you'll see the EQs will have, a lot of them will have like a frequency spectral analysis, and you are visually seeing what frequencies are too high and too low. And the same with compressors, though. A lot of them will show you the waveforms, and then they'll show you the actual waveforms getting squashed down. In the analog world, you don't have that. And what it does is it forces you to mix with your ears instead of your eyes. And so you have to start trusting your ears a little bit more. Now, another thing that I'm always been a fan of with analog is I find that I have to do a lot less when I'm boosting things in the analog world. Whereas digital, I find like if I'm EQing something, I'll probably have to boost it by 8 dB or something to get the same effect by only boosting 2 dB in the analog world. So I'll show you what I mean here. Over here, I got a little song that I've been working on. And let's focus on this kick drum right here. Right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull up this EQ and I'm gonna boost at 100 hertz here, and watch as I raise it up. Right, so I boosted that by about 8 dB just to be able to get some punch in there, and I find that I have to do much more than I have to do in the analog world. So let's go over here and I'm going to EQ it at the same frequency, 100 hertz, and I'm going to do it with these right here, these 550Bs. And I got it set to 100 hertz, and I'm going to boost by 4. So half of what we did with the plugin. So here's without it. And here's with it. Can you hear how that, just that 4 dB right there is causing it to just punch a lot more, and you're actually hearing more of an effect. Now let's come and listen to what the plugin is doing here. So here's without it, and here's with it. See, it doesn't quite have that same punch, and that's twice the amount of dB that we boosted with the 550B, the actual analog gear. Now, another thing that I want to touch on with a positive of analog gear is there's a lot of money to be made in reselling gear, right? So you get some gear and you use it for a while, and then you find that you don't need it anymore because you got new and better gear. There's such a huge market on eBay and reverb.com to sell like these EQs and these compressors, and I'm constantly seeing people sell them for maybe $100 or $200 less than what they actually purchased it for. And it's not the same thing with plugins, because with plugins, you buy them and you really can't resell them, and most of the companies, if you do sell them, you gotta resell them illegally, or there's just not the same market value for it because it's a software and there's no manufacturer cost for that. All right, so the last thing that I wanted to touch on with the positives of analog is analog can create some subharmonics that the digital world just can't produce. You know, there's some analog gear that can produce stuff that's way up to 100K. Now, granted, we can't hear that, but what it does is it creates these lower harmonics that our ears can hear, and that's what you start to hear with all this warm richness and all this thickness that you get with analog gear, and you just don't get that with plugins. Plugins happen to be a lot more transparent, I find. They don't have that same warmth, that same depth that you'll always get with analog gear. All right, cool. So let's go on to things that I'm not a fan of with analog gear and that I think is quite the downfall. The number one thing that I think is the biggest downfall is recall. It takes forever. It's not instant. Like I'll show you on even something as advanced as this SSL duality, it has the ability to save your parameters and everything. However, it's not like the digital world where you just pull up your session and it's already there. I actually have to go in and you can see on this channel there's these little rings around these EQ knobs. And so I actually have to go in and I have to move each knob until the ring goes away, and that's going to be where my settings was. Now imagine that across 48 channels. And that's something advanced like the SSL that can remember it. You know, so actually let's go over here to our outboard gear. And you'll find that most studios have these recall sheets in them. Most big studios will have these somewhere in the room. And it's an actual picture of the gear that you're using. But what you have to do is at the end of your session, you have to go in and you got to mark down like, all right, inputs at 7. Let's mark that down. The attacks at 7. Releases at 6. And you have to do that for all the gear that you used, right? And then you come back the next day. All this stuff is zeroed out because somebody else was used in the studio. You actually got to come in here and you got to, adjust the knobs to exactly what you had on the paper and times that by all the gear that you were using. It can take quite a bit of time. And another thing that I've noticed is some of the gear that's not notched, you can never get it exact. Like you may have wrote down that it was like, okay, the input's at 7, the attack's at 6, and then you come back and you listen to it after you recalled it, and it's like, wow, it's just not sounding the same. And so sometimes that can be quite a downfall because it takes that extra time to get it to where you want to be, right? So another thing that I think is a downfall of the analog world is that it can be a good and a bad. You can't save presets, right? On some of the gear you can, like the Eventide H3000 and like these reverbs, you can save presets, but something like the 550B or this distressor, there's no way to save this stuff if like all your parameters, so you got that down and it's not a matter of not learning the stuff, but you just want to save it because you really like how every time you do this, it sounds awesome on your kick drum. You can't just pull something up and go right off the bat and do that, right? Now, another thing that I think is a downfall of analog gear is there's no free updates. With software, there's constant things where you're getting emails from your company like FabFilter or Sound Toys, and they're like, hey, there's a free update. We fixed some bugs. We added like this new parameter on here. That doesn't happen in the analog world. What you buy is what you get, and you're stuck with that forever, Now, another thing, too, with that being said, that I think is a pretty big negative with the analog gear is that it's a lot of maintenance that can go into it, and hardware can break down, and when it breaks down, it can cost money to go get it fixed. It can take time, and then what do? You spend all this money on like a 550B, and now you got some mixes due to some clients, or you got some stuff that you got to get out, and you can't use the EQ that you wanted to because it's broken and you got to wait and everything. And there's also a lot of maintenance that goes into it. I know for me, I'm constantly in these studios taking these faders out and then cleaning them to make sure that all the dust and everything's out of it. That way they can move seamlessly and keep being able to be used. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on that I think is a negative for analog is there's limited bus options. You see, in the digital world, it's like unlimited almost. It's like how many your computer can handle. I know for Pro Tools, it starts out with just 128 buses, and then you can keep adding more. Now, with the analog world, that's not always the case. This SSL alone, it only starts off with 24 buses, and that's in mix A, and we have three different mixing areas that we can go to, mix A, mix B, mix C. So that only gives us about 72 busing options. Versus again with the digital world, it's basically unlimited until your computer can't handle it anymore. And I know for me, I like to mix a lot of big sessions. I'm constantly doing stuff where clients send me stuff with like, 100 plus tracks, and I like to go all out on my bussing because I get a lot of use out of that. All right, so we went over the good sides and the bad sides of analog. So let's do the same for digital. So I'm going to start out about the positive things about digital. And the first thing right off the bat that I love is the instant total recall. If you pull up a session anywhere you are, boom, all your EQs and compressors and levels, they're exactly where you left them off at the last time that you saved that. Versus how we talked about earlier with the analog stuff is you have to go in and recall it. And I think that's a huge advantage with digital. Now, I think it's also really awesome that you can bring this stuff anywhere you go. You think about it, you got all these EQs and compressors and reverbs that you bought as plugins, and they're on your computer. You can travel with them, you can go to anywhere where in the world with it. And that's not very realistic when it comes to analog gear. I mean, how are you really going to bring all of this stuff everywhere you go? Even if you are that person that's like, nah, I'm going to bring it everywhere I go, you got to think that all that traveling is going to add some damage to it. So it's definitely just a lot more easy to travel around with it, and it can be really useful. Now, I know that I talked earlier about how the spectral analysis can be somewhat of a damper for when you're EQing because you should rely more on your ears. But I will say that it is a perk that the digital world does have that because it can be useful, especially on like a master fader after you've done all your mixes, and you can just kind of see where everything is as far as the balance and everything. Another really good thing about the digital world is you have the ability to do a lot different effects and stuff that you can't always do with analog gear. Like if you think about a plugin like Isotope's Trash or another plugin like FabFilter's Saturn, you can't really do that harmonic distortion and stuff that you can do with those plugins that you can do with analog. It just can't really do the same stuff. You can do so many different things. A lot of these plugins have so many things built into it where it's like a reverb, an EQ, a compressor, saturation, all in the same thing. And I think it's really awesome about the just unlimited ability to do really cool effects and everything. And like we discussed earlier, I think that it is a really big bonus that you can have consistent ability to update your software where you can't do that with the gear. Another thing is the digital plugins I feel are much more cost effective. If you think about it, there's always sales going on, they're always doing discounts, and they're just cheaper. Let's take some of this gear for instance. If you were going to buy like one of these 550Bs or these 560s by API, you'd be spending about brand new maybe $850 for just one of the actual EQs. If you get them used, maybe $500 to $600. But for the plugins, Waves makes the same a model of the same EQ, the 550B and the 560 and the 2500. And I know I bought that for like $100. It was on sale. I got it for $100, and I got all three of those EQ, the EQ and the compressor. And if you think about it, if you were gonna buy the analog stuff, you would be spending thousands of dollars, probably like $3 to $4 grand on all that gear alone. All right. I think one of the biggest advantages of digital plugins versus the analog stuff is if you buy one of the plugins, right, you can have that on an infinite amount of channels. Like you can literally put it across like 1,000 channels if you want. You know, you can just take your EQs and you can just keep applying it. There's no limit to how many you can put it on, right? Now think about if you were to buy the analog gear, you're stuck with just having to use like this Neve 1073. You buy it and you can only use it on one channel at a time, you know, and so you're not getting the same value that you could with digital plugins where you could literally just have this stuff on so many things. And why wouldn't you want to? I mean, if you bought it, why not get the most use out of it? All right, so the last thing I want to touch on with the digital world is we talked about it a little bit when I was going through the cons of the analog stuff, but I have an unlimited amount of busing options inside of my software. I can literally make as many as this computer can handle until it crashes, but it allows me to be able to have things routed inside the computer to several different places that I want to go with it. All right, we went over some positive things about digital plugins, so let's go into some downfalls of the digital world. The first thing that I feel sometimes is there may be too many options with each plugin. If you think about some of the FabFilter stuff, their stuff has so many different options that you can go in and do there, and it can make it even more confusing, and sometimes it just makes it harder to make a decision. It's like, where do I start? Where do I go? But if I'm using some analog gear, it's a little bit easier to be like, all right, well, there's only like 5 knobs on this thing, or, you know, like the LA2A, I just go in and dial 2 things, and there's no presets on there. So it's like, well, here's my decision. I'm going to go with it. And speaking of presets, I do think there is a downfall to presets. I think that they can make it less desirable to learn what each parameter is doing. If someone just pulls up like a compressor or something, and they each time they just go right to this preset that says punchy vocal, right? And they just do that every single time, and they've been doing it for years, but they never learned what each parameter in the compressor is doing. They don't know what the attack is doing, what the release is, what the ratio, what the thresholds are. And so when you start to get into like other studios, you may not know what to do because, you know, you've been relying on presets for so long. Now, another thing is that a lot of plugins are modeled after classic analog gear. Like I said, I bought the API stuff from Waves, but it doesn't have the same sound all the time. You know, it doesn't have that same analog warmth. It doesn't have that pristine top end that I find in some analog gear. It seems to be more transparent and just more of like a clear sound. And sometimes I feel like that's not the best for mixing because I want some of that dirtiness that I get from the analog world. So another thing is, let's say earlier we're talking about how I can put the plugins on an infinite amount of channels. And that's really cool. I love that. But using too many plugins can start to cause latency if your computer can't handle it. Sometimes you can create your computer to crash, and you know you'll lose everything that you did. Whereas like if the power went down in the studio or whatever, and it came back on in a little bit, your gear is still where it's at. You know, you don't lose it like you would on it if your computer just shut down. And so we talked a little bit about the spectral analysis throughout the whole time. And I have good things to say about it. I got bad things to say about it. But again, I'm going to throw this in the con area for digital. I feel like sometimes people rely too much on the spectrum analysis. They'll just be like, oh, this frequency is too high, so I'm just going to, you know, lower that down. And they may even do that without even listening to the song and everything. So there you have it. Those are some things to consider when making your decision between analog and digital. In the analog world, we have the ability to physically touch the knobs and the faders. We get that really awesome analog warmth and that harmonic content that we don't get in the digital world. And it forces us to rely more on our ears instead of using presets all the time. But the downside is it takes a lot longer to do your recall. It can be expensive, and there's a lot of maintenance to consider when having the analog gear. And in the digital world, we're able to have that total instant recall anywhere that we go. We have the ability to save presets. It's way more cost effective. We can always do updates, and there's a lot of options. But the downside is sometimes with all those options and those presets, it makes us not learn the parameters and the gear as well as we should. And sometimes using the plugins too much can cause your computer to crash. And we don't always get that same analog warmth and stuff that we would if we were to use the actual physical gear. Well, I appreciate you listening to this video, and feel free to chime in on the comments of what kind of tutorials and stuff that you'd like to see. SoundOracle and I are always looking to give you the content that you want, so any feedback helps. And be sure to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube at Realistic Productions. You can find me on the web, realisticproductions.net, and make sure you go to soundoracle.net for the dopest sounds in the world if you really want your beats to have like just the best bump to it and the best sounds. And follow him on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, just everywhere at SoundOracle.